My name is Mallory, a 30-year-old software architect living in Seattle who always believed that silence was the ultimate form of strength until my family mistook my patience for complete weakness. Less than 15 minutes after my parents' 30th wedding anniversary dinner began, my older sister Kendra decided to lean provocatively against my husband Grant, while whispering something into his ear that made several relatives gasp in collective shock. Instead of reprimanding her inappropriate behavior, my mother Lydia let out a soft laugh before announcing to the entire table that Kendra and Grant actually looked like a much more compatible couple due to their shared, vibrant energy. My father, Franklin, nodded in agreement as he raised his glass, casually remarking that it was a shame Grant hadn't met the more attractive sister first, because their chemistry was undeniably superior to whatever dull marriage I was currently providing. I sat there in a state of icy numbness while watching my own flesh and blood turn my marriage into a cruel public joke. But they had no idea that Grant was already clutching a digital file containing a 20-year-old secret that would effectively dismantle my mother's reputation by the end of the night. The smug smile on Kendra's face was about to vanish because we weren't just there to celebrate an anniversary. We were there to witness the total collapse of a household built on 2 decades of lies and infidelity. Before I reveal how my husband exposed the truth that left my entire extended family in absolute silence, please take a moment to tell me what time it is and which city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you believe that no one should ever have to endure such disrespect from their own parents, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to support my journey toward justice. Your engagement helps me share these difficult lessons with more people, so feel free to leave a comment below about your thoughts on family boundaries as we dive into the events that changed everything for me. Everything in my life had been a preparation for this moment of total severance, rooted in a childhood where my value was constantly weighed against the glittering, hollow presence of my sister Kendra. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Seattle, our house was a monument to Lydia's obsession with social standing, a place where every piece of furniture was chosen for its ability to impress strangers rather than its comfort for those living within its walls. My mother was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper judgments, a person who viewed motherhood as a competitive sport in which Kendra was her star athlete and I was merely the equipment manager. I remember the long afternoons spent in the foyer watching Lydia brush Kendra's golden hair with a rhythmic, reverent intensity, whispering about the glorious future that awaited a girl of such rare beauty, while I sat in the corner with my drafting pencils unnoticed and uncelebrated. Franklin. My father was a man whose affection was a commodity that had to be earned through public achievement or aesthetic appeal. And since I was a quiet child who found more joy in the structural integrity of bridge designs than in the shallow gossip of garden parties, he treated my existence like a regrettable footnote in his biography. The favoritism was not a subtle thing that whispered in the shadows. It was a roar that echoed through every hallway of our mansion, dictating who got the larger bedroom, who received the more expensive gifts, and whose voice was allowed to carry the conversation at the dinner table. Kendra leaned into this dynamic with a predatory grace, learning at an early age that she could erase my presence simply by demanding more light for herself, a tactic that Lydia encouraged with a pride that chilled me to the bone. Whenever I achieved something significant like winning the regional mathematics competition or securing a full scholarship to a top-tier university, the news was treated as an inconvenient interruption to Kendra's latest minor drama, such as a broken fingernail or a disagreement with a popular girl at school. Lydia would sigh heavily when I showed her my awards, telling me that it was a shame I was so focused on dry masculine pursuits, instead of developing the charm that would actually make me a credit to the family name. Franklin was even worse, often suggesting that my academic success was a sign of a social deficiency, a way to compensate for the fact that I would never possess the magnetic pull that Kendra exerted over every room she entered. They built a world where my sister was the sun, and I was a cold, distant planet expected to orbit her brilliance without ever expecting warmth in return. This systematic marginalization forced me to build a fortress within my own mind, a place where logic and structural engineering provided the stability that my parents refused to give me. I spent my teenage years in a state of hyper-observation, noticing the way Lydia would check her reflection 20 times before leaving the house, and the way Franklin would bury himself in his business ledgers to avoid the crushing emptiness of his marriage. Kendra's entitlement grew into a monstrous force as we entered adulthood, leading her to believe that she had a divine right to anything I possessed, whether it was a piece of jewelry, a professional contact, or the attention of a man. She lived a life of nomadic luxury, drifting from one failed venture to another, while Franklin funded her every whim, yet she was the one praised for her bold, adventurous spirit, while I was labeled as robotic and ungrateful for working 60 hours a week to build my own architectural firm. Lydia often told me during our forced holiday gatherings that my lack of softness would lead to a lonely life, suggesting that if I didn't learn to be more like Kendra, I would end up as nothing more than a wealthy ghost in a house of blueprints. They never understood that my independence was a survival mechanism, a way to ensure that they could never hold their wealth over my head like a guillotine. Every time I stepped into that Seattle house, I felt the air thicken with their collective disdain, the unspoken demand that I apologize for my success because it highlighted Kendra's stagnation. The tension between us was not a sudden fracture, but a slow, decades-long erosion of the soul, a process that Lydia managed with a surgical precision that kept the family looking perfect on the outside, while it rotted from within. I watched as they curated a family legacy of lies, ignoring the growing distance between us because it was more comfortable to believe in the myth of the happy family than to face the reality of their own cruelty. Little did they know that the daughter they had spent 30 years silencing was the only one who truly saw the cracks in their foundation, and that I was quietly documenting every moment of their betrayal for a day when the truth would finally be the only currency that mattered. 4 years ago, the dynamic of our family was irrevocably altered when I introduced Grant to my parents during a cold, rainy November evening that was supposed to be a quiet engagement dinner, but quickly turned into a theater of the absurd. I had met Grant at a structural engineering conference in San Francisco, where his brilliant mind for data forensics and his quiet, unshakable integrity had immediately captivated me in a way no one ever had. He was a man who saw the world in patterns and truths, a trait that I knew would inevitably clash with the decorative lies that Lydia and Franklin had spent their lives perfecting. When we arrived at the Seattle estate, my mother didn't even bother to hide her disappointment looking at Grant's sensible suit and modest car, with a sneer that suggested he was a delivery driver rather than my future husband. Kendra was draped across the velvet sofa in the parlor, a glass of expensive champagne in her hand, and she didn't even stand up to greet us, instead choosing to look Grant up and down with a predatory curiosity that made my skin crawl. Within minutes of sitting down for the first course, Franklin began a relentless interrogation about Grant's family history and his net worth, clearly unimpressed by the fact that Grant was a self-made analyst who had built his own firm without the help of a trust fund. My father made several cutting remarks about the mediocrity of the middle class, suggesting that a man of Grant's background should feel honored to be sitting at a table of such high pedigree. Lydia joined in by remarking that it was a shame I hadn't chosen someone with more social weight, telling Grant to his face that I had always been prone to settling for less than I deserved, because I lacked the imagination to dream bigger. Throughout the meal, Kendra exerted her usual influence, interrupting every story Grant tried to tell with a loud mocking laugh, or a story about her own superior experiences in Europe. She began to flirt with him in a way that was so blatant, it was embarrassing, leaning across the table to touch his hand while asking him if he didn't find the Seattle social scene a bit too sophisticated for his Midwestern sensibilities. My parents didn't reprimand her. In fact, they seemed to enjoy the spectacle, with Franklin commenting that Kendra had always been the one who knew how to make a man feel noticed. Grant remained remarkably composed, his hand finding mine under the table and squeezing it with a strength that told me he saw exactly what they were trying to do. He wasn't intimidated by their wealth or their hollow titles. Instead, he watched them with the same clinical detachment he used to analyze a corrupt data set. Later that night, as we were leaving, Lydia pulled me aside to whisper that Grant was unacceptably ordinary, and that I shouldn't be surprised if he felt out of place in a family of our caliber. Kendra followed us to the car, leaning into Grant's window to tell him that if he ever got bored with my rigid routines, he knew where to find someone who actually knew how to live. It was a disgusting display of the family's core values, a moment that confirmed Grant's suspicions that the people who raised me were nothing more than high society bullies. Over the next few years, as we moved toward marriage, the family's treatment of Grant became a consistent pattern of psychological warfare. They invited us to events only to ignore him, made jokes at his expense during every holiday dinner, and constantly compared him unfavorably to the wealthy, unstable men Kendra was dating. Lydia would often call me to vent about Kendra's latest romantic disaster, inevitably ending the conversation by saying that at least Kendra's life was vibrant, unlike the gray, predictable existence I shared with Grant. My sister's attempts to sabotage our relationship never ceased. She would send Grant suggestive texts under the guise of family bonding, or show up uninvited to our home in revealing clothes when she knew I was working late at the firm. Grant, however, was far more observant than they realized, and he began to use his professional skills to investigate the family that was so determined to undermine our happiness. He noticed the way Lydia's stories about her early years of marriage never quite aligned with the public records of the time, and he began to see the suspicious patterns in the family's offshore accounts that Franklin seemed to be oblivious to. Grant didn't tell me what he was doing at first, wanting to protect me from the potential fallout, but he was quietly building a digital dossier of their deceits. Every time Franklin insulted his career or Lydia mocked his upbringing, Grant would simply add another layer of evidence to his research, knowing that one day he would have the power to dismantle their arrogance with a single click. We lived our lives in the city, building a successful and honest partnership, while the Seattle estate continued to fester with the rot of 3 decades of lies. My parents viewed Grant as a weak link they could easily break, never suspecting that the man they dismissed as a boring analyst was actually the most dangerous person they had ever invited into their circle. By the time we reached the 3rd year of our marriage, the tension was so thick, it was almost a physical presence at every family function. Yet we remained the perfect patient couple, absorbing their insults with a smile that hid our true intentions. I was no longer the frightened girl who sought their validation. I was a woman with a husband who saw the world for what it truly was, and together we were preparing a reckoning that would leave the Seattle estate in ruins. 3 months before the 30th anniversary party, I decided to take on the monumental task of organizing the entire event, a decision that I knew would serve as the final test for a family that had never truly seen me as their own. I poured my heart, my professional reputation, and my personal savings into securing the most prestigious waterfront venue in Seattle, hiring world-class caterers, and coordinating a floral design that was meant to be a masterpiece of elegance. Throughout the entire planning process, my sister Kendra acted as though she were the one in charge, calling the vendors behind my back to change the color schemes to shades that better suited her complexion, and demanding that the seating chart be rearranged to place her at the center of the most influential guests. When I tried to assert my control over the event I was paying for, Lydia told me to stop being so obsessive and difficult, reminding me that Kendra had a natural eye for beauty that a numbers person like me could never hope to possess. My mother spent every phone call bragging to her social circle about the lavish party she was hosting, never once mentioning that I was the one working 18-hour days to ensure every detail was perfect. Franklin remained characteristically aloof, only chiming in to demand that the wine cellar be stocked with vintages that cost more than most people's annual salaries, treated my financial contribution as a debt I owed the family for years of perceived mediocrity. My best friend Josie sat with me one afternoon over coffee and begged me to walk away from the whole project, pointing out that I was essentially paying for the privilege of being insulted by my own relatives. She saw the exhaustion in my eyes and the way my hands shook when Kendra sent me another list of absurd demands, but I told her that I needed to see this through to the absolute end. I explained to Josie that this party was not a celebration of my parents' marriage, but a closing argument in the long, painful trial of my childhood, a final gesture that would prove once and for all that no amount of effort would ever be enough for them. Grant was even more concerned than Josie, as he had recently made a significant breakthrough in his investigation into my mother's hidden history, and knew that the upcoming party would be the perfect stage for a total collapse of their facade. He watched me labor over seating charts and floral arrangements while Kendra posted photos on social media, taking credit for all the hard work I was doing, even going so far as to tell our aunts and uncles that I was struggling financially and that she was the one who had stepped in to save the party from being a disaster. When I confronted her about these blatant lies, Kendra laughed in my face and told me that no one would ever believe a drab, boring person like me could throw such an elegant affair anyway. Lydia supported the lie by nodding along when guests praised Kendra's taste during the preliminary cocktail hours, leaving me to stand in the corner like an unacknowledged servant in my own life. It was during these 3 months that Grant finally obtained the irrefutable evidence he needed, a series of private bank transfers and encrypted messages that linked my mother to a man named Mr. Miller, a former business associate of my father who had vanished from the local scene 20 years ago. Grant showed me the files late one night in the quiet of our office, his voice steady as he explained that Lydia had been maintaining a secret life with Miller for 2 decades, using Franklin's wealth to fund Miller's failed businesses and luxury lifestyle. The shock was a cold, visceral wave that left me breathless, a realization that the woman who had spent my entire life lecturing me on morality and social propriety was a fraud of the highest order. Every time she had criticized my marriage or judged my character, she was doing so from a throne of absolute deceit, protecting a secret that would destroy my father's pride and his financial legacy if it ever came to light. Grant asked me if I wanted to cancel the party and confront them in private, but I looked at the mountain of evidence and felt a sudden sharp clarity that I had never experienced before. I told him that the party would go on exactly as planned, but the guest of honor would not be my parents' marriage. It would be the truth, presented in a way that they could never deny or escape. We spent the final weeks before the event, preparing a digital presentation under the guise of a heartwarming tribute to 30 years of marriage, a file that was actually a detailed documentary of my mother's betrayal. Kendra continued to harass Grant with suggestive texts and unwanted visits, convinced that she could tempt him into a scandal that would finally humiliate me in front of the entire family. She had no idea that every message she sent was being logged and saved, added to the arsenal of evidence we were building against the entire family structure. Franklin remained oblivious, his ego inflated by the looming celebration of his supposed success as a patriarch, never realizing that his favorite child and his devoted wife were the very people dismantling his life. I felt a strange sense of calm as the day of the anniversary approached, a feeling of icy detachment that allowed me to navigate their insults with a smile that was finally genuine, because I knew it was the last time they would ever have power over me. The restaurant was booked, the flowers were delivered, and the guests were invited to witness what they thought was a celebration of love, but what was actually the public funeral for a 30-year-old lie. I looked at the reflection of the woman who had organized this masterpiece of a party and didn't see a victim anymore. I saw a woman who was about to set herself free with a single click of a button. My parents and sister were so blinded by their own vanity that they never saw the storm coming, even as the first clouds began to gather over the harbor on the night of the event. They thought they were the masters of their universe, but they were about to learn that the person they had spent 3 decades silencing was finally ready to speak with a voice that would shatter their world. The evening of the anniversary gala arrived with a heavy, oppressive fog rolling off the Puget Sound, mirroring the suffocating atmosphere inside the private waterfront ballroom, where 40 of our closest relatives and most influential family friends had gathered. I had spent the entire afternoon ensuring that the lighting was perfect and the floral arrangements were flawless, yet the moment Lydia walked into the room, she pulled me aside to hiss that the centerpieces looked common, and that I had clearly tried to save money on the wine. Kendra was already at the bar wearing a dress that was more suited for a gala in Monte Carlo than a family anniversary dinner, and she was making a spectacle of herself by flirting with our cousins and leaning provocatively against every man who came near her. When the dinner finally commenced, the tension at the head table was thick enough to choke on, as Grant and I sat across from my parents and sister under the watchful, judgmental eyes of the entire extended family. Kendra began her assault less than 15 minutes into the first course, leaning over to Grant and loudly whispering that it was a tragedy he was married to someone as stiff and predictable as me when he could have had someone with a real pulse. She then reached out and ran her fingers along the back of Grant's neck, a gesture so bold and inappropriate that several of our aunts stopped eating to stare in collective shock at the blatant disrespect being shown. Lydia didn't tell her to stop or reprimand her behavior. Instead, she let out a soft, tinkling laugh before announcing to the entire table that Kendra and Grant actually looked like a much more compatible couple due to their shared, vibrant energy. My father Franklin nodded in agreement as he raised his glass of vintage Bordeaux, casually remarking that it was a shame Grant hadn't met the more attractive sister first, because their chemistry was undeniably superior to whatever dull functional marriage I was currently providing. The humiliation was a physical weight in my chest, a burning heat that made it difficult to breathe as I watched my own flesh and blood turn my marriage into a cruel public joke for their own amusement. I looked at the relatives who were watching this execution, some with pity, and others with the kind of sick curiosity that drives people to watch a house burn down, and I realized that in their eyes I was exactly what my parents said. I was a background character in Kendra's life. Kendra became even more emboldened by the wine and the lack of consequences, eventually going so far as to suggest that Grant should take her out for a real night on the town to see what he was truly missing in a woman. She joked about how our lives must be so incredibly boring behind closed doors, implying that I was more of a roommate than a wife, while Lydia nodded in sympathetic agreement, as if my marriage were a tragedy they were all forced to witness. I sat there in a state of icy numbness, feeling Grant's hand steady beneath the table as he gave me a look of pure, cold determination that told me he was ready whenever I was. One of our uncles tried to steer the conversation back to the purpose of the night, but Kendra was relentless, laughing about how she could always steal whatever I had if she really wanted it, because I didn't know how to hold on to anything of value. Lydia broke the tension by saying that we shouldn't be so sensitive because family was a place where the truth could be told with a smile, even if that truth was that I had married a man who was clearly out of my league in terms of personality and spark. I looked at the woman who had birthed me and saw only a stranger whose vanity had completely eroded her capacity for empathy or common decency, a person who found joy in the public destruction of her own child's dignity. Franklin joined in one last time, stating that a man of Grant's potential deserved a partner who could command a room rather than someone who preferred the company of blueprints and spreadsheets, effectively dismissing my entire career and character in a single sentence. It was a calculated three-way assault on my self-worth that had been 30 years in the making, a final confirmation that I would never be enough for them, no matter how much I sacrificed or achieved. The guests at the nearby tables began to whisper in shocked tones, caught between the spectacle of my sister's blatant seduction and the shocking complicity of my parents, who seemed to be enjoying my public execution. Kendra reached across the table to grab Grant's wine glass, taking a sip while maintaining intense, predatory eye contact with him, an act so disrespectful that the entire room fell into a temporary, stunned silence. Lydia broke the silence by saying that Kendra had always been the passionate heart of the family, while I was merely the reliable clockwork, a comparison that made me feel like an object rather than a human being. I realized in that moment that they weren't just being mean. They were trying to break me one last time before the night was over, to ensure that I remained in the shadow they had created for me. Grant finally spoke up, his voice calm and devoid of the anger they were clearly trying to provoke, as he thanked everyone for their honesty and suggested that it was the perfect time for the special tribute we had prepared for the happy couple. He stood up and walked toward the large projector screen at the front of the hall, and for a fleeting moment I saw a flicker of genuine fear in Lydia's eyes as she realized she was no longer in total control of the room's narrative. Kendra leaned back in her chair with a smug expression of victory, believing that the upcoming slideshow would be just another platform for her to showcase her beauty, alongside our parents' long-standing lie of a perfect marriage. They had spent the entire night trying to burn me down for their own amusement, never imagining that I was the one who had already doused their house in gasoline and was simply waiting for the right moment to strike the match. The air in the ballroom felt electric, a heavy static that made the hair on my arms stand up as the lights began to dim, leaving only the glow of the screen and the sound of my own rhythmic, steady heartbeat. I looked at the woman who called herself my mother and realized that this was the last time she would ever look down on me from her throne of deceit, because the mechanical daughter they had spent a lifetime dismissing was about to dismantle their world with a precision they would never forget. As the first slide appeared on the massive screen, the room was filled with the expected nostalgic images of my parents' wedding day in 1995, but the music accompanying the photos was a haunting minor key melody that immediately changed the mood from celebratory to foreboding. The guests leaned in, expecting a heartwarming story of 3 decades of love, but instead they were met with a series of crystal-clear photographs taken over the last 20 years in various hidden locations across the city. Franklin looked confused as the images shifted from black and white wedding memories to high-resolution shots of my mother Lydia sitting in intimate cafes and upscale hotel bars with a man who was definitely not my father. Grant's voice then resonated through the speakers, cold and analytical, like a judge delivering a final sentence, as he began to narrate the timeline of a calculated betrayal that had started nearly 2 decades ago. The man in the photos was identified as Mr. Miller, a name that made Franklin's face turn a sickly, ashen shade of gray as he recognized his former business partner, whom he had supposedly cut ties with after a financial disagreement years ago. Grant didn't stop at the photos. He began to display bank statements that highlighted a systematic siphoning of family funds' money that I had provided for emergencies into a private account used to support Miller's lavish lifestyle and gambling debts. The room became so quiet that you could hear the hum of the projector as 40 of Seattle's elite watched the evidence of Lydia's double life unfold in excruciating, undeniable detail. My mother stood up, her face a mask of pure horror, and began to scream that this was a deep fake and a malicious lie created by a jealous daughter who wanted to ruin her reputation. Grant simply stepped in front of the laptop, his presence an immovable barrier, and told her, "The truth is a persistent thing, Lydia. You can't silence a digital trail as easily as you silenced your daughter for 30 years." Kendra was frozen in her chair, her flirtatious smirk replaced by a look of sheer panic as a specific set of messages appeared on the screen, showing that she had not only known about the affair for years, but had actively helped cover it up in exchange for Lydia's help in hiding her own financial disasters from Franklin. The betrayal was multi-layered and total a complete fraud that had been perpetrated in the very house where I was told to be more like my mother if I ever wanted to be a real woman. Franklin's hand began to shake as a specific document appeared, a letter written by Lydia to Miller, in which she confessed that she had never truly loved Franklin and only stayed with him for the financial security and social status he provided. The guests began to whisper in shocked tones, their eyes darting between the screen and the woman who had spent years lecturing them on the importance of family values and marital loyalty. Franklin finally found his voice, but it wasn't the booming tone of a patriarch. It was the broken rasp of a man who had realized his entire legacy was an illusion, whispering, "I gave you everything, and you turned our home into a sanctuary for a thief." Lydia's only response was to hiss at me, calling me a traitor to my own blood, to which I finally replied, "Blood didn't stop you from stealing my savings to pay for your lover's lifestyle, so don't you dare speak to me about loyalty in a room full of people you've lied to for 20 years. Grant then turned the attention toward Kendra, showing a final series of recordings where she had mocked Franklin's intelligence and laughed about how easy it was to keep him in the dark as long as they kept him feeling like the king of his castle. My sister's complicity in the affair was the final blow for the relatives who had always viewed her as the perfect daughter, exposing her as a manipulator who valued her mother's secret over her father's honor. The presentation ended with a single devastating sentence on the screen: 30 years of marriage, 20 years of lies, and 1 night of absolute truth. Franklin looked at Lydia with a mixture of hatred and profound sadness, before walking out of the hall without a word, leaving his wife and favorite daughter to face the judgment of the crowd they had invited to celebrate them. The guests began to exit the room in a hurry, desperate to distance themselves from the stench of the scandal, their silent departures speaking louder than any words of condemnation could. Lydia was left standing in the center of the hall, her expensive gown now looking like a shroud as the very people she had spent decades trying to impress turned their backs on her with looks of pure disgust. Kendra attempted to chase after one of our influential aunts, pleading for her to listen to her side of the story. But she was met with a cold stare and a sharp rejection that echoed through the emptying ballroom. I stood at the back of the room watching the woman who had spent 30 years calling me ordinary and uninspiring crumble into a heap of ruined silk and shattered vanity. Grant closed the laptop and walked back to my side, his hand finding mine in the darkness of the room, a silent confirmation that we were finally irrevocably free from their influence. We didn't wait for the fallout or the excuses. We walked out of the ballroom and into the cool Seattle night, leaving the remains of my family to drown in the truth they had worked so hard to bury. Behind us, I could hear the sound of the servers beginning to clear the tables, the clinking of silverware, the only sound in a room that had once been filled with the hollow laughter of a family that never existed. They had wanted a night to remember, and we had given them one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a moment of justice that had been 20 years in the making. As we drove away from the waterfront, I looked at the reflection of the city lights on the water and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what they would say about me. The mechanical daughter had finally dismantled the machine that was trying to crush her, and in the wreckage I had found the strength to finally walk away. The fallout from the anniversary party was not a gradual decline, but a total and immediate collapse of everything Lydia and Kendra had spent their lives building. By the time the sun rose over the Puget Sound the next morning, the scandal had already permeated every elite circle in Seattle, fueled by the digital files that Grant had ensured were sent to the appropriate legal and social channels. Franklin didn't even wait for the business day to begin before he had his primary attorney file for an emergency divorce and an immediate freeze on all joint bank accounts, effectively cutting Lydia off from the wealth she had used to sustain her double life. He moved his belongings out of the Seattle estate and into a high-security hotel, refusing to speak to Lydia or Kendra, and he hired a private security team to ensure they couldn't gain access to his office or the family records. The legal battle that followed was not just a simple divorce. It was a forensic audit of a 20-year embezzlement scheme that left the legal community in shock. Grant provided the authorities with a meticulously organized folder of every wire transfer Lydia had authorized, proving that she had laundered over $4 million of Franklin's wealth and my personal savings through various shell companies managed by Miller. Because of the specific moral turpitude and financial fraud clauses in their pre-nuptial agreement, Lydia was stripped of her right to alimony, leaving her with nothing but her personal wardrobe and a mountain of legal debt. Kendra tried to sue me for emotional distress and defamation caused by the public exposure, but her case was laughed out of court when Grant submitted the recordings of her attempting to bribe him into silence weeks before the party. My sister found herself in an equally precarious position, as the scandal had tainted her brand as a social media influencer, leading to the immediate termination of several high-profile contracts that were her only source of independent income. She was forced to vacate her luxury penthouse within 30 days, moving into a cramped studio apartment in a part of the city she used to call the slums, while the bank repossessed the car Franklin had bought for her. Every luxury they had used to intimidate me was stripped away piece by piece until they were forced to face the harsh reality of a world that no longer cared about their names or their fake status. Lydia attempted to flee to Canada to find Mr. Miller, only to discover that he had vanished the moment the money stopped flowing, taking whatever remained of the secret accounts with him. My mother was left alone in a city that now treated her like a social pariah. Her phone calls unreturned and her social invitations rescinded by every organization she had ever belonged to. The very friends who had been laughing at her jokes 48 hours ago now spoke about her with a mixture of pity and contempt, terrified that any association with her would tarnish their own fragile reputations. I sat in our quiet apartment with Grant, watching the fallout from a distance, feeling a strange sense of detachment rather than the satisfaction I had expected to feel. We received dozens of frantic, hysterical messages from Lydia, ranging from desperate pleas for mercy to venomous threats that she would destroy us both, but I didn't respond to a single one. I simply blocked every number she used and directed her lawyers to our own legal team, refusing to give her the emotional engagement she so desperately craved. The reality of the situation finally set in for my mother when she realized that her favorite daughter Kendra was now blaming her for ruining both of their futures with her selfishness. The sisters and parents who had once stood as a united front of arrogance were now tearing each other apart in the press, with Lydia accusing Kendra of encouraging the affair for her own benefit. It was a pathetic, ugly display of people who had never learned the value of loyalty or truth, and I watched it with the same clinical interest I would use to study a failing structural design. My father reached out to me once, his voice sounding 10 years older, as he apologized for the decades of neglect and the way he had allowed them to humiliate me. I told him that while I appreciated the apology, it didn't change the fact that I no longer felt like his daughter, and that our relationship had died in that ballroom along with his marriage. I realized that Franklin was just as much a part of the problem as Lydia was, as his own vanity had required him to have a perfect family at the cost of the one child who was actually honest with him. We sold our home in Seattle and prepared to move across the country, wanting to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and the wreckage of the people who shared my DNA. The house on the hill, once a symbol of their superiority, was eventually sold at a public auction to pay for the mounting legal fees and debts Lydia had accumulated. I felt a profound sense of closure as I watched the moving trucks drive away from the city, realizing that I was finally taking my life back from the people who had tried to steal it for 30 years. They were no longer the giants who haunted my dreams, or the voices that told me I wasn't enough. They were just three broken, desperate people who had learned too late that you cannot build a life on a foundation of lies. The Seattle fog finally seemed to lift as we crossed the state line, revealing a clear, bright horizon that I was ready to walk toward, with Grant by my side. I was leaving behind the ashes of a 30-year deception, and for the first time in my life, I felt the warmth of the sun on my face, without the shadow of my family looming over me. 6 months have passed since the night that the truth finally shattered the world I was raised in, and the peace I have found in the aftermath is something I never thought possible in my lifetime. Grant and I have settled into a beautiful, quiet home in a coastal town in Maine, where the only thing that matters is the honesty we share and the life we are building together from the ground up. I am no longer the woman who hides her achievements or shrinks her presence to make others feel larger, because I have finally realized that my strength was never the problem their insecurity was. The legal battles in Seattle have finally concluded, leaving Lydia and Kendra in a state of permanent social and financial exile that they will never truly recover from in this lifetime. My mother now lives in a tiny one-bedroom apartment working a retail job at a department store she once would have deemed beneath her dignity, while Kendra struggles to find anyone in the city who will even give her a chance at a meaningful career. Franklin remains alone in a new, smaller house, a man whose wealth cannot buy back the 30 years he wasted, or the daughter he chose to lose, because of his own blindness. I recently received a long, rambling letter from Kendra, filled with the same manipulative tone she has used her entire life, asking if I couldn't find it in my heart to help family during a hard time. I didn't even finish reading it before I dropped it into the fireplace, watching the paper curl into black ash and realizing that I felt absolutely nothing for the woman who once had the power to make me cry. The blood that connects us is just a biological fact, not a moral obligation to endure abuse or participate in a lie that was designed to destroy me. I have learned that family is something you choose and build through consistent actions of respect, honesty, and love, not something that is forced upon you by birthright or social expectation. My life is now filled with people who value my mind, my heart, and my integrity, and I no longer spend a single second wondering if I am enough for the people around me. I have become the architect of my own happiness, building a structure that is reinforced with the truth and decorated with the peace of mind that comes from walking away from toxicity. For those of you who are currently trapped in the suffocating web of a toxic family, I want you to know that there is a way out, and it starts with the courage to see the truth for what it truly is. You do not owe your life or your loyalty to people who only want to use you as a backdrop for their own vanity, and you are not responsible for the wreckage that occurs when their lies finally catch up to them. Your silence is not a sign of weakness, but a reservoir of power that you have every right to use to set yourself free when the time is right for you. I hope my story serves as a powerful reminder that the truth is the most effective architect capable of tearing down the most elaborate of prisons to make room for a life that is actually worth living. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this long and difficult journey, and for allowing me to share the hard-won lessons I learned in the shadows of my past. It means the world to me that my experiences might provide a glimmer of hope or a spark of courage for someone else who is currently struggling to find their own voice in a world of lies. If you have ever felt like the outsider in your own family, or have faced the betrayal of those who were supposed to love you most, please share your thoughts and your own stories of resilience in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and it reminds me that we are never truly alone in our collective struggle for justice, truth, and self-respect. Please remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our future stories of strength and survival, as your support helps us grow this community of truth seekers. Thank you for your time, your empathy, and your presence here today. It has been a profound honor to tell you my story and to finally stand in my own truth. May you always find the inner strength to stand in your own light and the wisdom to walk away from anything and anyone that tries to dim your brilliance for their own comfort. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been treated unfairly, I hope this story gives you some courage to stand up and defend yourself. Don't forget to comment and subscribe so we can spread positive value.